I wanted to begin by thinking through the cultural assumptions that we have when it comes to death and dying. So the title of our discussion tonight was Why Americans Are So Afraid of Death. And people might object to this, maybe you might object to this and say, fear of death isn't a uniquely American thing. This is something that all humans have been concerned about across all of time. And yet, there does seem to be something specific about our cultural moment. So I want to know what you think about the American perspective on death, sort of as we're experiencing it today. Maybe if you want to begin, we'll let Dr. Hauerwas keep reading.
Well, there's a wonderful prayer. There's a wonderful prayer in the Book of Common Prayer. This is Otna's new book, so I can't find it immediately. But it's the prayer of a sick person that says, if I'm to do nothing, may I do it gallantly, which I think is a wonderful prayer to indicate that illness and death doesn't stop us from praying and being gallant in our prayers. So that was what I was looking for.
That's beautiful and worth it. Thank you.
And if you want to read more of his reflections on that, there's an essay in the Journal of Christian Bioethics in which he unpacks that further with a colleague. So, why, Stanley, are Americans afraid of death? Why don't you have the first word on that?
Well, as sin came into the world through one man, and death came. As sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin. When have you heard a sermon in church that death came through sin? I think on the whole, Christians have been very good at avoiding the fact that sin alienates us from God. And if you are alienated from God, death is one of the modes of that alienation. So how you talk about death is generally not in play given the grammar. Let me do this. How many of you have heard a sermon on death in your church? That's not too bad, about maybe a fourth. But on the whole, you never hear a sermon on death, except maybe at a funeral where it might be mentioned.
It's sort of hard to avoid at that
time. Americans think if they just get good enough at medicine, they can get out of life alive. Funerals are the alternative to that, where you are made up as a dead person so well you look better than you look. So funerals are meant to say they're not really dead. When I was a kid growing up, I remember that my first confrontation with death, we were Texans in a little small white frame church. There was an elderly man in his 80s who held his hearing aid up to hear the preacher. And we were told that we were to love Dad Haggard because Dad Haggard loved us, little kids. I never saw any evidence that Dad Haggard loved little kids, but we were told to love him. And sure enough, he died. And it was a hot Saturday, and we were in the church, and I was there with my parents. I must have been 5, something like that. And we started going. Suddenly, I realized everyone was standing up, and they were in a line to go by the open casket. And I didn't want to go. I didn't want to see a dead person. And we got there, and my father picked me up to look in to the casket. I was just scared. And we weren't people that had a lot of money. And they had put a red sash across his chest with Elmer's glue and sprinkles of kind. And it said, "Eternity's now." And he had never looked better. I think people would like to think eternity is now, in a way that secures a sense of the eternality of something called the soul, that on the whole leaves God out of the picture. I mean, what happened and what happens in sin is our alienation from God, which is death. And we simply don't know how to say that to one another.
One of the reasons Americans are afraid of death, and here Americans are like probably everyone in the North Atlantic industrialized countries, is that we, unlike any period in history, we are shielded away from the sight of death and the actual experience of seeing people die. Most of us, we don't. I mean, just a century and a half ago, a third or a half of the kids were dying before they got childhood. So everybody saw a child die. There were no hospitals in the middle of the 19th century, so nothing like we have currently. So when people die, they died in the home. So people don't see death very much. That's part of it. And yet, I have seen hundreds of people die in my work, and I'm an American and I'm terrified of death. And this has been brought up close to me in the last week when the younger brother of a good friend dropped dead in his early 40s, a father of 4 young children, of probably a heart attack. And the mother of a classmate of one of my kids died after a long illness with cancer in early 40s. And I found myself feeling my mortality and not feeling sanguine about it, you know. So I suspect that what's happened in our culture is that we know that death is going to separate us from everything we love, and we have come to love deeply things which we will definitely be separated from. It's terrifying for us. And I observe for most people who are dying, it's pretty terrifying.
I was visiting with Tommy Langford, which some of you may have known, who had been provost at Duke and dean of the Divinity School. And it was the day before he died, but of course we didn't know it was the day before he died when I was visiting him. And I asked him, I said, "Tommy, are you afraid of dying?" And he said, "No, that would be philosophical. It would be a philosophical mistake." By that he meant that you can't experience your own death. It's philosophically, it's a very tricky business of knowing what it means to die. But then he said, "But I'm going to miss my friends." I think death, interestingly enough, gestures a loneliness that just threatens us deeply. And the fact that we are promised a life with God doesn't make death any less terrifying, but it does promise that we will have a friend. That's a very deep commitment. I think, interestingly enough, I've thought a lot about death. I'm a theologian. But I didn't think much about growing old. Growing old is a hell of a challenge. And how to feel the life life going out of you is something that we need to give to one another. Because what I mean by that is, as you grow older, you necessarily become more dependent. And dependency is a gift we give to those who have not yet become dependent. And how to be friends of those who no longer can do what they once did is an ongoing challenge of Christian fellowship. And that, I think, is what is missing in so many lives, and why it is that Americans, on the whole, who think they ought to be independent, have trouble coming to terms with death because they can't come to terms with aging.
We see that, we certainly see that in the relative isolation of those who are older and more debilitated into institutions where they can be concentrated and managed and kept from interfering too much with most of our daily goings on.
It's interesting. My mother was in the C.C. Young residential facility in Dallas, sponsored by the Methodists. The Methodists aren't good at very much, but they're pretty good at providing retirement. And you gotta be good at something. And when I visiting her fairly often, I begin to realize how difficult friendships are within retirement context. How many deaths can you experience and know how to go on? So it's a deep challenge to know how friendships work as we grow older.
It seems like some of the reasons that came out of that are that it's inevitable, death is inevitable, that it represents loss of the things that we love here on earth, that it can be isolating, and that the aging process is terrifying in and of itself. And it seems like we've had a cultural response to this in which we're not just ignoring it or kind of hiding it away, but that we're attempting to stop death, to pretend that it doesn't happen. So I'm thinking of the movements in medicine towards dermatology to make us seem like we're forever young, or for plastic surgery that also kind of preserve youth, or even kind of in philosophy and ethics, this idea of transhumanism, that we can use technology to prolong or even evade death. And we're pouring resources kind of into these areas. And so I'm curious how this fits into this idea of being afraid of death, because we're not just ignoring it, we're actively trying to fight it, and what that is all about.
Neither Stanley nor I have availed ourselves of these resources available to make us. I don't know what to say about that, except that it does seem endemic to the human condition that people have wanted to try to make themselves look younger, long past the point where that was more than kind of pathetic exercise. But I guess it's a sign of, I don't know, there's got to be something good in that, Stanley. What is the good in there that's getting corrupted?
I don't think it's good at all. I don't think it's good because, I mean, insofar as aging is now becoming an illness, you can see the corruption of medicine. Because if aging is an illness, then that means that you want to try to defeat it in a way that has some normative idea of being young. And if it's the same kind of logic of why is breast enhancement a therapy? The very idea that that your body needs to be transformed by a plastic surgeon in order to be more attractive. Why is that medicine? I think that the attempt to, why, I put it more controversially perhaps, why is the failure to experience pregnancy in which you use IVF, why is that understood as illness? The very expansion of medicine into the attempt to make us better than we are physically is a very dangerous development.
So I certainly agree with Stanley about that, but I think I'm reminded of the good that is being corrupted here. The good is the gift of health, which when we age, we have a health that's fitting for us at that age, but it is a diminished health. Stanley is less healthy than he was at 40, and I'm less healthy than I was at 40. And yet, so I think that good, understandably pursue it, but then the distortion is we want to hold on to it as if it's ours to keep forever, rather than something that's just of its nature as a mortal creature, something we're going to have to watch dissipate and ultimately will be taken from us, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the same time as we have this resistance to death and we're fighting it with all we can, some people have kind of looked at culture and made the assessment. I'm thinking of Pope John Paul II had a line that we're experiencing a culture of death. And so evidence of this would be kind of the rising suicide rates among teenagers, which is just tragic, or even movements in medicine for euthanasia, or sometimes called physician-assisted suicide. And that seems almost like an embrace in some ways of death.
Don't leave out abortion
Yes.
as part of the culture of death. One of the most dangerous aspects of modernity is how compassion has become a killer. Namely, if you say, well, a Down syndrome child it would be better off that they not be born because they're going to suffer from being Down syndrome. Therefore, compassionately, you abort them. That's murder. And it's murder in the name of compassion in a way that corrupts us and the world in which we find ourselves. The same is true. I say that within 100 years, if Christians are identified as people who don't kill their children or their elderly, we will be doing pretty well, because it's coming, I believe. And how we as Christians can claim that we would not have those who are on the point of death to say that they want to relieve us of caring for them by having their own life hurried to end is a very dangerous business, and you sure don't want to get physicians into it. But I fear it's coming, all in the name of being good.
Indeed, the organization that has led quite effectively the political movement to promote physician-assisted suicide is called, anybody? Compassion. And so there's the first first leg, is we have a tremendous cultural emphasis on compassion. But the key is that compassion in the modern era, after a few hundred years of kind of a deep skepticism about whether we can have any knowledge about what's good and evil in fact, and about what is good and bad for another person, compassion has become essentially expressed in doing for another what he or she wants done for them. Helping another live out their authentic life and enact their authentic death. So that's compassion. And the second word that's the dominant word of our cultural time, and this organization put it in their title, I think, sadly, is choices, which is kind of the inverse of the other side of the same coin. If what makes our life worth living is that we can make choices and live the life we want to live, authentically live out what we internally perceive as it means to be true to who we are, without respecting any external frame of reference or received wisdom, and certainly not something like a Christian tradition, then the last choice we have when we face the loss of all of our choice making, as we look at death, we have advanced cancer, or have dementia, we can see starting to come on, or we have, in some countries, someone who has a severe disability. The last choice we can make is the choice to cause our own death. So there's a kind of terrible irony in that, that the last exercise of choice is to destroy the capacity to make choices. But it does seem to have a kind of internal consistency. By making choice the most important thing, when you can't make choices, a sensible thing seems to be to cause your own death.
Don't forget, part of the culture of death is war. It's war. I mean, people, evangelicals oftentimes want to be against abortion. But if you're against abortion, you ought to have deep worries about war. And that needs to be said and worked out.
Thank you. So, in response, my question is just, what are Christians to make of this? Can we give an account of the good of aging? Is there good in aging? Is there a proper place for death in our lives? What is how can Christians respond to all of this?
I will say, I'll just comment on what I've observed, and maybe leave to Stanley the comment on the kind of key theological substance here. But what I've observed when Christians die in a way that seems to be reflective of being Christians, and the mother of my daughter's classmate, I think, exemplified this quite powerfully. It is not that they make death into something to be embraced, much less something to be kind of, to have some kind of sappy story about, that this is, Jesus is overcoming, and so I'm just celebrating on my way to heaven. Because that generally rings false. But rather, they are able to lament the loss of the beautiful things they've been given, including their friends and family, and yet hang on and communicate the hanging on patiently. Pick up that prayer that Stanley was looking for. Communicate they're patient, meaning they're not desperately resisting, they're not lashing out, accept and lament, which is a way of lashing out to God that Christians have been able to say is a fitting way of lashing out. But they are hanging on in faith to the truth that is at the heart of the gospel, that God is going to have the last word, and that his friendship with them, because of Christ's death and resurrection, will not be overcome, even by death.
When my father died, my wife and I were in Egypt, so it took a while for us to get back, and I always knew I should preach my father's funeral. I'm not ordained, but I had permission. And it was about as good a funeral as we Methodists could do.
Accepting the preacher?
Except actually, I thought I was pretty good. And we had Eucharist as a way of remembering we're part of communion. My father is part of that communion. He was to be cremated, and we had to wait. It was on a Friday. We had to wait through the weekend for his ashes. And I hadn't thought about it, but the pastor of the church that my father was a bricklayer, and he had built this church. The pastor of this church then we went to the cemetery, and he was going to have a short service for the disposition of the ashes. As part of that, he then read a poem that said, he's not really dead, he's just passed over. And you therefore can reach him anytime you want. I wanted to kill the son of a gun. He was dead. My mother loved it. And I think that is the kind of thing we confront often as Christians. Paul and I are communicants at the Church of the Holy Family, which is just right up the street, as you know. And we, at All Saints, we take the time to read the name of every person that has died in our congregation that has kept us going. I think that's not, I hope to be part of one of those names. And of course, people will not know what that strange name names, but it makes me part of an ongoing community that I think is extremely important.
Just a couple other thoughts that come to my mind. One is very practical. I think Christians can, in our time, practice talking about dying and death and avoiding euphemisms, just as a way of speaking truthfully. That's a simple thing. And the other thing that strikes me, and this is the much harder one, is that to prepare to die, the saints have been clear about this, is to go ahead and die to yourself. Paul's able to say, I've been crucified with Christ, I no longer live. And it wasn't just an intellectual exercise for him. It was, I'm done. I'm done with my old way of life. I'm not calling the shots. I've been reborn into the new life that Christ has brought me, and then that seems to be that's the way Christians prepare to die, is to be done with the ways of the world and with living for ourselves. I'm not preaching that because I would need to preach it to myself before I preach it to anyone else, but that seems pretty clear.
And at the heart of that, Jesus is not dead. Jesus died and was resurrected. And that makes possible a hope in an ongoing life with Christ. We don't speculate about what that will look like, but it does mean that Christ is still having effects. You're here. That's one of the effects. And that is absolutely critical for us being a people who are able to stare death down in a manner that it does not rule our lives. Remember, death is one of the powers, and the powers have us in a manner that our very ability to try to will our way free of the powers reproduces them. So how to be a people capable of recognizing death in a way that doesn't let it determine who we are as those who Christ continues to be present to, is part of the challenge, it seems to me, that we face in the world in which we find ourselves.
Yeah. So I'm wondering what it looks like for communities, churches, families to live this out in practical ways. And so one of the scenarios that kind of comes to mind as being super challenging is what we're supposed to do in the face of tragic death, of untimely death. It's one thing to age and to face death as a natural end to that. And it's another thing to have it snatched away seemingly so unfairly.
Children are the great challenge. Let me be unbelievably gauche, but I actually wrote a book called Naming the Silences, God, Medicine, the Problem of Suffering. It's about the suffering and death of children. And what I think is entailed is we live in a world in which people have children, but they haven't got the slightest idea of why. When I taught a marriage course at the University of Notre Dame, I would ask the kids what reason would they give why they ought to have a child. And they would say things like, children are fun. I would say, think about your brothers and sisters. Our children are there because our parents want them. And we're not going to plan to fulfill those kind of. And I would tell them, well, if you're married, you know, having children is a duty, and they hated that. But there's a certain sense that marriage is a calling to have children. The problem is, given the incoherence of having children morally in this society, you think they've got to be perfect, namely that a child with a hair lip is tragically born, something like that. It is the case that some children are born dying. And if you've been in a pediatric ICU, it tears your heart out, but it is right that they have to die. How to be a community that can absorb that is a great challenge, but it is absolutely necessary, because the other side of it is you just put them to death. I'm sure you've seen it.
Yes, I remember in the early 2000s, I believe it was, an article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine called the Groningen Protocol for Newborns. And it described in the Netherlands the practice that was now being made public, that had been developed and allowed by the authorities there, of killing newborns that had unbearable hopeless and unbearable suffering. That was the English translation of the Dutch way of putting it. Hopeless and unbearable suffering.
And then your mind say it.
Exactly, with spina bifida. So these were kids with spina bifida, and it hit me so powerfully, both to see doctors euthanizing babies, but also I have a first cousin who lived 14 years with severe spina bifida, died 20 years ago. But I immediately knew that is the most untruthful thing to say, that a baby has hopeless and unbearable suffering, and we must kill it in order to prevent that suffering from going on. When the reality is, you don't find anybody with spina bifida saying, I'm hopeless and have unbearable suffering, please kill me. So it clearly is just an expression of, we don't have hope for going on as parents of this child, and the hospital facilitates us not having to. I don't do pediatric palliative care, only with adults. I only know from my colleagues who do, particularly Ray Barfield, who's a colleague to both of us, that the suffering and anguish and loss when a child dies is just another level higher than what we generally see with adults. And I remember years ago, my wife and I, for an hour or so, couldn't find our daughter. Just anybody's parent has probably been through that. It's a level of terror that you don't, that I haven't experienced in other ways. So there's something particularly awful about losing your child.
Absolutely. So in terms of our approach moving forward, for people to kind of walk out of here and have some sense of what it means to live as a good Christian who sees death as the inevitable end, what are the spiritual virtues that we're trying to inculcate within ourselves? I'm thinking about prayers like the classic 18th century, like, now I lay me down to sleep, pray the Lord my soul to keep, I should die before I wake, or for him my soul to take, kind of thing. Or in my tradition we have one where we pray for a perfect end. But what are the components of a perfect end, and how do we prepare ourselves to face it well?
To never believe in a perfect end. I can't imagine imagining a perfect end. I think the bottom line for me is to be surrounded by people who will tell me the truth. Just give me that. That has to develop prior to the crisis. But I just don't want to have bullshit in my life at the end.
I will say, watching, again, hundreds of people die, that if you don't want bullshit in your life at the end, you have to get rid of the bullshit in your life before the end. Because, you would think when people are dying that, people ask me this sometimes, what is it like when people are dying? You'd think they would be, locked in. And there would be, once you know you're dying, you start to do things you would have done it had you known you were dying before. But the reality is, what most people do when they're dying is what they've done all their life. If they've been neurotic and frantic and anxious and demanding, that's what they continue to be. If they've been open-handed and generous and patient, that's what they continue to be. If they've watched baseball, they're watching baseball in the hospice room. And I'm reminded, it was actually 20 years ago, I remember hearing Stanley give a talk in which he spoke of the fact that historically, I think in the Anglican communion, but I think also in the Roman Catholic communion, there was a liturgical prayer that was often prayed Lord, that included the line, Lord, save me from an untimely death. By untimely, the prayer meant one that just hits me, that I don't have time to prepare for. And, hearing about Kobe Bryant die, of course, thousands of people are dying every day. But what hit me, the sadness of it, was that he did not have a chance to know that he was going to die and to reckon with his friends, with his family, and with his God. And so Christians have borne witness to that one of the things that we want to do is turn our face upward and outward and make amends, reconcile, repent, prepare ourselves. We should be doing that every day, but when death is on the close horizon, all the more. There's a tradition that developed in the middle centuries called the Ars Moriendi. It came to be called the Ars Moriendi, and it was, as best I understand it, came up around the time of the bubonic plague, when there were not enough clergy to really perform the rites around people who were dying that were the standard rites of the church, because so many people were dying so fast. And the church kind of gave its not official endorsement, but it encouraged the dissemination of really like comic books, basically prints, that could instruct people on how to die. And it was basically, each print was kind of an image of the temptations you'll face, to despair, to pride, and so on, and gave people an image of how to kind of prepare themselves spiritually and get ready to die.
Yeah, let me blurb another very wonderful book by Alan Verhey called Ars Moriendi, and it's just terrific.
The Christian Art of Dying.
Christian Art of Dying. The prayer to save us from a sudden death is in the Great Litany. And I unfortunately can't either, the Acna people left it out.
It's in there.
I can't find it. It's they wanted to be saved from a sudden death because they wanted to make sure and have time to be reconciled with God. So they wanted to have time to confess their sins and to be forgiven as part of the ongoing dying process. Now it's interesting that patients ask doctors to keep them alive to the point that when they die, they don't have to know they're dying. So it's a way to produce forgetfulness, whereas the church's "save me from a sudden death" was a way of remembering what you were doing.
And I'll say practically one of the leading edges in the problematic, I think, push within the domain of medicine to get doctors to aid in dying, basically to make the person's death their end, is the practice of palliative sedation or unconsciousness, which is not accepting sedation, the loss of consciousness, as a side effect when you have some good reason to relieve pain or other symptoms, which the church has always accepted. But instead, it's for folks who just say, I can't take sitting here thinking about the fact that I'm going to die. I want to be out of it. And physicians will kick them out and keep them out until they die.
Yeah, we haven't talked about pain, but pain is such a deep reality oftentimes. And I'm a great supporter of heroin as one of the ways of dealing with pain.
You mean narcotics generally, right?
Right.
There are forms of heroin. The truth is, they are basically different formulations of the same drug.
Thank you for this dialogue. We want to leave some time for question and answer. So if we could transition to that now, but thank you, Delaney and Stanley and Farr, for the ability to do that. The way we're going to do this is if you have a question, Matt will be sort of running the mic up and down the aisle. So if you could either make your way to him, or if that's not doable, he can make his way to you. But he's not going to let go of the microphone. It's just going to be easier if he keeps the microphone while you ask the question.
Excellent. All right, questions? All right, Dr. Craig.
Do you find that most Christians are more afraid of dementia than they are of dying?
In my observation, I think they think maybe more about dementia as they age. I don't know if they're more afraid of it, but they're afraid of both for sure. My father is 80 and a young 80, like similar to around Stanley's age, and he's definitely much more worried about dementia than dying.
I don't know. I think having dementia is a little like being mentally handicapped. People think when they see someone that is intellectually disabled that they would rather be dead than be them. But what that does is project on the person that's intellectually disabled my view of what I would be if I were them, but I'm not. And so it doesn't mean because they're intellectually disabled that they would rather not be. They would rather be, because all they know is who they are. I think that's true of people with dementia too, that what happens is we lose who we are. If you've been around anyone that's suffering from severe mental illness, you get some of the same reaction. Namely, you can't imagine being what they are. But that's not their problem.
Just briefly, if you want to read a wonderful book about this topic, written by a wonderful theologian, friend of ours, John Swinton, I forget the exact title, I think it's Dementia, Living in the Memories of God. So I recommend that to you.
All right, other questions?
Hi, thank you. How about I talk to my friends and family who are not Christians about that?
The way porcupine is screwed very carefully. I don't think there's any given formula for making that possible. I always think that rather than starting with what do you value, what's the meaning of life, ask them what they want. What do you want? That at least gets stuff off the ground.
There was a man a couple thousand years ago who characteristically asked people, what do you want, in his ministry in Galilee.
Other questions? Yes.
So there's another form of hastening death called voluntary stopping eating and drinking. It can be accomplished in contemporaneous version where one has the mental capacity to elect for that path, and it's also in the advanced directed version. And I'm wondering if you think that both of those forms of hastening death basically fall under the categories of physician aid and dying. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll say briefly this can be justified either through the biblical warrant that we're not to kill, or it's been justified in a tradition, a long tradition, centuries old, Christian reasoning and natural law reasoning, that it's never reasonable to make your death your goal in your actions, to intentionally cause your death. So when someone is sick and for whatever reason, and they've lost their appetite, and they know that they're dying, and I see this quite frequently, and they stop eating and drinking, I don't think we want to call that, certainly not to call that suicide in most cases, but it's just they've stopped eating and drinking because it's no longer doing them any good. It's no longer giving them much benefit, and or it's now burdensome to them. When someone stops eating and drinking as their mechanism of getting themselves dead, that's something that the church has been really clear about. We don't have the freedom to do.
I've always thought hydration is the bottom line. I mean, if you're in a coma and there doesn't seem to be any good outcome, that you're not going to come out of the coma without dying, that people then that want to say, well, why don't you go ahead and put them to death, is because death needs to be the agent, not us. And you need to continue hydration, because dying of thirst is not a pretty business.
I will say, practically speaking, people who are conscious, and therefore people making choices, just don't stop drinking very often. That what people lose when they're sick is appetite. And then people will get to the point where they don't drink because they're basically dying, they're losing consciousness. But conscious people who are alert generally don't stop drinking unless they're trying to cause their own death.
Any questions from the right side of the room? I see one in the back.
You do that.
Hi, okay, I'm just gonna show this one. Just last week, we were at a summit for the March for Life through our Anglican denomination. And there was a lot of conferences there, and it was interesting because like the one thing that people got really up in arms and just angry about when people were talking about it was not anything to do with abortion. It was the one speaker there that was talking about death and the business of just the business of euthanasia, and also dealing with assisted suicide. And a lot of it had to do with the suicide part of it. And I think it had a lot of that, what I got from the fact that people were kind of very like emotionally bristling about it. I think it had a lot to do with people who had known others who had committed suicide and had that emotional kind of attachment to that that happening. And so I guess my question would be like, how do we, because one of the things that we were arguing about is how do you properly console somebody as a Christian, how do you properly console somebody who has lost somebody who killed themselves, basically?
Some years ago, I was giving a lecture at the University of Chicago Medical School to residents. They had a medical ethics rounds, and the week before I came, they'd done abortion, and they'd all come to the conclusion that if they were asked to perform an abortion, they would do it because their job is to do what patients ask them to do. You could tell they were very young. I said, okay, let's try a different set of issues. You're in the ER, you're rotating through the ER, and someone is brought in that tried to drown themselves in Lake Michigan. It's the winter and it wasn't iced up yet and the water was very cold. so they still are viable. They have a big plastic sheet on their chest that says, if pulled out of Michigan before I'm still alive, please do not resuscitate. And underneath it says, see the statement of my psychiatrist that I'm thoroughly sane. And then see my statement reflecting with Seneca about how suicide is the final form of autonomy that I want to live through. So please do not try to save me. And I asked them, what would they do? They said, well, of course, we'd try to resuscitate them. I said, really? Why? They said, well, it's our job as a doctor. We're to save lives. And I said, well, if you're to save lives, what gives you the right to impose your role specifications on this person that is trying to commit suicide? We debated this for a couple of hours, and they finally came to the decision that if the person came in the first time, they would try to save them, but if they came in the second time, they'd let them go. Now, one of the problems that we confront is what reason. The presumption is that anyone who tries to commit suicide has got to be sick. That's not true, as increasingly is apparent. So the question is, what right do we have to impose our specifications of what it means to live on someone that rationally is committing suicide? And all we need to do is change the name. Let's just call it life self-taking. What happened to Joe? Oh, he life self-took. Oh, okay. What we're confronting today is really a change in moral description. And that is extremely dangerous. And how that's going to come out is a real issue. What I'm suggesting is there's no way you're going to win that argument.
It's not accidental that those who are for assisted suicide and euthanasia bristle at them being called assisted suicide and euthanasia. At least that doctors participation in them. They want them called physician aid in dying to dissociate them from what they are. Whenever we use language in a way that seems to obscure the most plain description of what we're doing, that's a sign that that there's something untruthful going on. I will say this, to kind of get it to your question, there's an essay that Stanley wrote 30 years ago, probably, called Salvation and Health, Why Medicine Needs the Church. It's been anthologized in a few places. But I encourage you to read it. In it, he tells the story of it as an adolescent, having a friend whose mother died by suicide. And the thing I took from this essay, which I've had the pleasure of reading many times, is that and this goes back to the broader topic, one of the hardest things for us to do around people who have greatly lost a child, or are themselves dying, is to stick around. I've certainly observed this in hospice. When people are diagnosed with something terrible, people flood in to visit and so on, and then pretty quickly they pull away, generally. And so often people are rather alone toward the end. And then many Christians, I think, problematically have taken on this notion that they don't want to be bothers to people, and so they almost keep people away while they're dying. But it seems like one of the things that friends can do, certainly Christians should do as part of our life together, is just hang in there, regardless of whether you have something to say or not. Stanley also once said, don't just say something, stand there. Just be around and not go away when people are hurting badly.
notice what happens when you go into a hospital room and the person is a friend, and the first thing you do is say, can I roll your bed up? Or can I do something with these flowers and so on? You want to do something. But oftentimes there's not a damn thing you can do other than be present. Now, that's what Farr has to do oftentimes. He just can be present. He can't help much at all. And that is very frustrating for physicians, but they've got to learn how to do that, to simply say, simply because you're suffering and you're ugly, because oftentimes you're ugly, doesn't mean we're going to abandon you. Let that be a practice of the church.
My question is, how do you think the advancements and continued reliance on technology will affect the next generation's outlook on death? Do you think it will continue like the cycle of fear, or do you think that with seeing death more on just in the general media, do you think that they'll become more psychologically immune to the reality of death?
You know, I'll just say something briefly, that there's this whole intense leading edge of technological innovation that goes under a kind of banner of seeking to have indefinite life. Even life without a body, if we can find a way to make human consciousness capable of going on without a body. I'm confident we're not going to figure that out, because to be human is to be an animal of a particular form that is different from the other animals, but yet remains an animal embodied necessarily. So I suspect that technology may continue to tweak the edges of helping us live longer, and therefore, insofar as we can live longer and escape illness more successfully, death will become probably more and more scary, because it will be the thing that we are not exposed to and that we think we can avoid. But we've already seen, if you look at the advances in life expectancy, we're already leveling out at a kind of asymptote where we're not extending life substantially year over year like we were for several decades in the 20th century. And I suspect it's just going to be more of people being old and broken down and having to learn either to live with being old and broken down, or wanting to opt out through suicide and euthanasia.
Medicine is getting too expensive. We're now spending something like 17 to 18% of the gross national product on crisis care medicine. Crisis care medicine is interventions that work to keep someone and respond to someone's clear medical trauma. If you want to know, I mean, modern medicine doesn't increase the life of the population. Windows and sewage increases the life of the population. Good nutrition increases the life of the population. Their intervention in crisis care may keep you alive longer, but it doesn't keep the population alive longer. So I think what we'll be confronting, I'll be dead, but I think what we'll be confronting.
You passed on, Sam. He'll still be with us.
I think what may happen is we simply will not be able to afford the kind of training he's received. Do you think that's right?
Excuse me? definitely the proportion of money spent on medicine can't go up forever. It's already, we're showing signs that it's also starting to kind of reach an asymptote. So I don't know. I think that it's more problematic the way we meddle with people all their life long to marginally reduce their risk of something bad happening 30 years later than it is that we take care of sick people in the hospital when they get sick. But there are problems in the way we go about the latter as well. To me, if you had a medical system that and a financing system that ensured that people who are born with disabilities or encounter disabilities can get basic helpful nursing care and physical therapy and so on, and that when you're sick you get taken care of acutely, that'd be a pretty good system. And if we took some of our attention away from trying to reduce my risk from 1 in 40 to 1 in 60 of having a heart attack 20 years from now, we could free up some money. We could also free up some of our psychic resources to focus on other things that Christians know they can do.
Time for one final relatively brief question. Marcus, closest to me, so give it to him.
Hi. Is it possible to embrace death in any kind of noble fashion, in the sense of, say, an act of civil disobedience, where you know you will be killed, but is that possible?
Absolutely, it's called martyrdom. The martyrs are our paradigmatic people that teach us how to die. So there's no question that that's possible, because they're there.
There's a wonderful little book called The Theology of Illness by Jean-Claude Blanchet, which includes innumerable quotations from the early the Greek patristics, the Greek church fathers. And it was clear that they were wrestling with this a lot in the first centuries. And it seems to be one of these areas that Christians have a kind of built-in fitting kind of ambivalence about. One, we are to be, at times, disregard death and to fly in our pursuit of what God's calling us to be and do, even knowing that death is likely to come, or even certainly going to come as a consequence in certain cases. At the same time, we're never to seek to get ourselves killed. And Jesus did not go up to get himself killed in a certain way, and yet he went up with absolute knowledge that he would be killed. He set his face like flint. And so that's where we look.
The martyr can never seek to be killed. Their job is always to escape. But that turns out not to be possible oftentimes. But you don't want the sin of your murderers to be on their souls. So you prefer to escape.
All right, thank you so much. We're almost at 6:30, so at this point I'm going to invite our speakers to come off stage and take a seat in the front row, and also to give them a round of applause.